The last witness to Adolf Hitler's final hours has himself died.
He went on to say, "Here's Hitler, my boss, Eva, a friend of Eva, very normal, not like what is written."
He watched the world fall apart from inside a bunker buried beneath Berlin. As the walls closed in and Hitler faced his final hours, one man stood nearby, silent, loyal, and terrified. The man who guarded Hitler's darkest secrets has finally broken his silence, and what came out was not rage, not glory, but something far more disturbing. What really happened in those final moments that changed history and marked the end of the world's deadliest tyrant? Before the secrets came out, and before Hitler's last bodyguard told the world what really happened, there was the bunker, a cold, silent trap buried beneath Berlin. On the surface, everything was collapsing. Buildings were burning, Russian tanks were rolling in. But down below, inside the Führer bunker, Hitler was still giving orders, still clinging to a world that no longer existed, at least for him. This wasn't some high-tech war room. It was a tight, gloomy maze of concrete walls, stale air, and flickering lights. There were no windows, no sunlight, just echoing voices and the smell of fear. Hitler had moved in months earlier when it became clear Germany was losing the war. And now, in April 1945, he was spending nearly every hour down there, pacing, mumbling, and refusing to believe the truth that it was all over. But to really understand what was happening in those final days, we have to understand the man himself. Who is Hitler? Adolf Hitler, bunker. Adolf Hitler didn't start out as a dictator. He was once a struggling artist, rejected from art school, drifting through Vienna, angry at the world. That bitterness didn't fade. It grew. After World War I, he got interested in politics. By 1933, he had taken full control of Germany and turned it into a dictatorship fueled by propaganda, fear, and hatred. He promised a better future, but what followed was genocide, war, and destruction on a scale the world had never seen. Now, the man who once stood in front of cheering crowds was hiding underground, surrounded by a shrinking group of aides and officers. Above him, Berlin was a war zone. Soviet troops were closing in. His generals knew the fight was lost. But Hitler refused to leave the bunker. He believed death was better than surrender. In April 1945, some tension arose. It was Hitler's birthday, and he was turning 56 instead of celebration. The bunker gasped with tension. There were water shortages, failing electricity, constant shelling. He was physically weak, trembling, and barely able to walk without help. Mentally, he was slipping fast. He called for maps, ordered imaginary reinforcements, and accused those closest to him of betrayal. It was at that moment Hermann Göring suggested he take control over everything. Hitler exploded. He stripped Göring of every title and called him a traitor. Göring, for context, was one of Hitler's oldest allies. He led the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and was once seen as Hitler's likely successor. He loved power, lived in luxury, and saw himself as untouchable. The same thing happened with Heinrich Himmler after he tried to negotiate peace with the Allies behind Hitler's back. Hitler didn't just fire him, he ordered his execution. Himmler wasn't just any official. He was the head of the SS, the paramilitary group that ran the concentration camps. While Hitler gave the orders, Himmler made sure they were carried out. He was cold, calculated, and terrifying, and was the architect behind the worst of the Nazi regime. As the war came crashing down and the truth could no longer be ignored, Hitler started saying he wasn't leaving that bunker alive. "Now I shall remain in Berlin and die here," he said. This wasn't a dramatic outburst or some passing thought. He was serious. He began talking openly to everyone about ending it all, like it was part of the plan. The cyanide capsules were already in the bunker, but there weren't enough for everyone, so he calmly explained that some people would need to use a gun instead. That was how far things had spiraled. He wasn't scrambling for a way out. He was preparing for the end. Then something happened that shook even the most loyal in the bunker. Hitler decided to test the cyanide, and he used his dog. Blondie, his German shepherd, had been with him for years. She followed him everywhere, even into the bunker. But now, he forced a capsule into her mouth, cracked it between her teeth, and watched as she collapsed and died right there. It was his way of making sure the substance worked. And while some in the bunker clung to the faintest hope of survival, others were already preparing to follow him into death. One of the most fanatical was Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's trusted propaganda minister. Even though Hitler had named him as the next leader of the Reich, Goebbels couldn't picture a future without his Führer. In his mind, there was no point in living if Hitler was gone. He had brought his entire family down into the bunker, his wife, Magda, and their 6 young children. Together, they made a decision that would leave even hardened soldiers speechless. They weren't just planning to die, they were planning to take their children with them. As if this was some twisted form of loyalty. This was the level of devotion inside that bunker. It was the world Hitler created in his final days. Even Eva Braun, a lady who had stayed loyal to him for years, made it clear she wasn't leaving. She calmly accepted her fate, even choosing to use substance to leave a beautiful corpse behind. This loyalty led to a quiet wedding inside the bunker, hours before both of them took their own lives. But before the demise, Hitler wrote 2 documents. One was a political statement where he called out those he felt had betrayed him. The other was his personal will. He named Karl Dönitz as his successor and blamed the Jews for everything, even in the end. It was pure delusion written from a world that no longer existed. Fast forward to April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva retreated to their private room. A gunshot followed. Staff rushed in. Hitler was slumped on the couch, a bullet wound in his head. Eva had taken cyanide. Their bodies were carried upstairs, draped in blankets, taken outside, doused in petrol, and burned in a shallow crater. But the fear didn't go away after they had passed away. The people left in the bunker were frozen in shock, surrounded by the final crackling of flames and Soviet bombs drawing closer. And in the middle of all that silence was one man. Hitler's bodyguard. He saw it all, heard everything, and for almost 70 years, he kept the truth to himself. This is where everything shifts, because what his revelations aren't in the history books. So who was this man who stood so close to Hitler when it all came crashing down? He wasn't a general or a politician or some high-ranking official. He was something else entirely. Let's go back to where his story begins. The bodyguard. His name was Rokas Misch. At first glance, you wouldn't think much of him. He didn't look like a soldier or some hardened Nazi commander. He was quiet, sharp-eyed, and serious. But for 5 years, he served as Hitler's bodyguard, phone operator, and personal assistant, working closer to him than almost anyone else. When the war reached its final days and the walls of the bunker started to shake, Misch was still there. He hadn't planned to end up in that world. Misch was born in 1917, raised by his grandparents, and served in the Waffen-SS during the war. He was wounded early on, and that injury changed everything. Instead of going back to the front lines, he was transferred to the Führerbegleitkommando, Hitler's personal security unit. From then on, his job was to protect one of the most dangerous and disliked men in history. Whether he liked it or not, he was in, and the only way out was possibly death, if he was fortunate enough. Life inside the bunker was nothing like the propaganda films. It wasn't polished or powerful. It was cramped, tense, and heavy with dread. The deeper you went underground, the less the world made sense. There were no windows, no fresh air, just stale cigarette smoke. whispers in dark corners, and that constant thud of Soviet artillery overhead. Fear was everywhere. You could see it in people's faces and hear it in the way they spoke in half sentences. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Who's going to snap first? You couldn't tell who still believed and who was already preparing to run. And right in the center of it all was Hitler. The man inside that bunker wasn't the mighty Führer people once screamed for. Misch saw it firsthand. The tremors in his hands, the way he shuffled when he walked, the lost look in his eyes when no one was talking. Hitler was falling apart, mentally and physically, and he wasn't hiding it very well anymore. Misch said he often saw him sitting alone, staring off into nothing, quiet for hours at a time. The man who once commanded armies by shouting into microphones now looked like he could barely carry himself, and yet no one dared say it out loud. What makes his story so hard to pin down is that Misch stayed. You might be wondering, why didn't he leave? Why not walk away from all of it? Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was survival. Or maybe, after being in that world so long, stepping away would have felt like a betrayal too. Misch watched a powerful empire collapse from the inside. He saw the man behind it crumble, but seeing Hitler fall apart in the bunker was only the beginning. What raucous Misch witnessed behind closed doors went far beyond weakness. It pulled back the curtain on a side of Hitler the public never saw. So, who was this man when no one was watching? Hitler unmasked. The private man revealed. The Hitler raucous Misch saw in the bunker wasn't the same one the world feared. You'd expect rage and maybe fire. But Misch said something that flips that image on its head. Hitler was mostly very calm. It sounds odd, doesn't it? Calm while the world around him collapsed? While Berlin crumbled above their heads and his closest men turned against him? But that's exactly what Misch remembered. He said historians and filmmakers exaggerated the mood down there. There was no screaming, no wild speeches. Silence was the weapon, not bravado. And then, every once in a while, something happened that didn't feel like war at all. Occasionally, life in the bunker had moments that felt oddly intimate. Misch once walked into a private passageway and saw Eva Braun seated in a flimsy nightie. She pulled a finger to her lips, signaling him to be quiet. It was rare and felt like a different world inside that bunker. The image sticks because it doesn't fit. You don't picture the woman beside Hitler in a nightie, shushing a bodyguard. But it happened, and as the end drew closer, Hitler showed a different kind of surrender. Misch described how Hitler shook hands with his adjutant, Otto Gunsche, and released all soldiers from their oath of loyalty. In that gesture lay acceptance. He wasn't planning a grand final stand. He was letting go of power. Generals and aides were told their duty had ended. It was a moment of clarity, emotional, not explosive. It was surrendered in a handshake. The act of releasing fellow soldiers turned the bunker into more than a tomb. It became a space where loyalty gave way to inevitability. Soldiers heard the order and grasped what it meant. The Führer no longer required them. They were free from a promise they could no longer keep. However, outside that bunker, a different story was already taking shape. Rumors flew through Europe. People whispered about Hitler escaping, using body doubles, ditching the bunker disguised. Misch's silence finally debunked most of those tales. He never saw any double or trick. There were no escape plans, no secret tunnels. Hitler stayed put. No one saw him leave before taking his own life. Now, with each piece of his story, we start to see that what we thought we knew about Hitler's final days barely scratches the surface. And what comes next in Misch's memory is where everything really starts to shift. The last day. On April 30th, 1945, Raucous Misch described the Führer bunker as a concrete coffin where a suffocating silence and constant fear replaced the atmosphere of a military headquarters. It was Hitler's last day on Earth, but nobody expected it to be that day. Misch was making a phone call at his usual post by the switchboard when something shifted. A voice suddenly rang out. "Linge! Ling, I think it's happened." That voice was calling to Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet. You see, Misch didn't hear the actual gunshot, and neither did many others. But the weight in the room changed instantly. Then, Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest men, ordered everyone to be quiet. Misch later said the tension in that moment was louder than any broadcast he'd ever heard. Still on the phone, Misch did something strange. He started speaking loudly on purpose. He said he didn't want to feel like he was sitting in a death chamber, even though he knew exactly what kind of place he was in. The door to Hitler's private room opened. Misch peeked inside. The gory images before him would eventually stick with him for the rest of his life. Misch explained what he saw in plain words. "I saw Hitler slumped with his head on the table. Eva Braun was lying on the sofa, with her head towards him. Her knees were drawn tightly up to her chest. She was wearing a dark blue dress with white frills. I will never forget it." The scene presented the world's most feared man, silent and still, alongside the woman who chose to die with him, creating an image that felt incomplete, as if caught in an unfinished story. Soon after, Bormann gave the order to open Hitler's door completely. Staff came in with blankets. They wrapped the body, and as they carried him past Misch, he noticed Hitler's legs sticking out from under the cloth. Then someone called out to him, "Hurry upstairs! They're burning the boss!" But Misch didn't move. He had noticed something strange. He saw something that made his gut twist. Heinrich Müller from the Gestapo was there. That guy was never around unless something serious was happening. Misch turned to his friend Henschel and whispered, "Maybe we'll be killed for being the last witnesses." And even as all this was happening, something even more disturbing was already unfolding below. The next day, the bunker turned even darker. Misch watched it all happen. Eva and Magda Goebbels had already decided they were going to die with their men. Eva Braun had kept her word. She had died with Hitler. And Magda Goebbels, wife of Joseph Goebbels, had made the same promise. But her plan went further. She didn't just mean to die with her husband. She planned to take her 6 children with her. Straight after Hitler's death, Mrs. Goebbels came down to the bunker with her children, Misch later said. She started preparing to kill them. She couldn't have done that above ground. There were other people there who would have stopped her. That's why she came downstairs, because no one else was allowed in the bunker. She came down on purpose to kill them. Misch remembered exactly where the kids were. "The kids were right next to me and behind me," he said. "We all knew what was going to happen. It was clear. Nobody stopped it." Hitler's personal doctor, Ludwig Stumpfegger, showed up with something. "I saw Hitler's doctor, Dr. Stumpfegger, give the children something to drink. Some kind of sugary drink," Misch said. And then Stumpfegger helped carry out the murders. No one had to say it out loud. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. There was no screaming or protest, just quiet horror. An hour or two later, Mrs. Goebbels came out crying, Misch said. She sat down at a table and began playing Patience. Misch saw it, lived through it, and even years later, he still remembered it like it had happened yesterday. The war may have ended in that bunker, but for Raucus Misch, the real fight was still ahead. What happened after he walked out would change the rest of his life. Decades of silence. When the war ended, it didn't end for Raucus Misch. He thought walking out of that bunker meant freedom. Instead, it opened the door to another kind of prison. The Soviets caught him not long after Berlin fell. He was dragged off, questioned, and shoved into a nightmare he hadn't seen coming. Initially, he was held in Moscow's Lubyanka prison, a place known for making people disappear, as the Soviets sought answers, not just random soldiers. The Soviets were convinced Hitler might have slipped away. They wanted to know if Hitler had escaped, if there were secret routes out of the bunker, or if Misch had seen anything that could prove Hitler hadn't really died. Misch said what he could, but that wasn't enough. Eventually, he was sent deep into the Soviet forced labor system, prison camps scattered across Kazakhstan and Siberia. Report says he was behind bars for about 8 or 9 years. He labored in freezing conditions, under constant guard, far from home. Many prisoners never returned. Just before New Year's in 1954, the Soviet authorities released him under an amnesty. Misch returned to Germany. But returning alive didn't mean returning whole. Misch was deeply hurt. The trauma hung around him. He rarely spoke of what happened inside those prisons. He had survived the bunker and surrounding chaos only to live in silence for decades. But why? Some say it was fear. Others say guilt. Misch had seen too much, and talking about it could get complicated. But maybe, at the heart of it, he stayed silent because the memories were too heavy or even too dangerous to speak out loud. Still, the silence wasn't forever. As the years passed, people started asking questions. Historians, reporters, filmmakers, they all wanted to know what it was really like in that bunker. What did he hear? What did he see? What was Hitler like when everything was falling apart? And that's when Misch finally started to talk. He never framed what happened in moral judgments. He told the truth, the way he saw it. History is history, Misch said. It was the way it was, and nobody should lie about it. This attitude shaped how he told his story. Still, the things he said made people uncomfortable. Misch once said mass murder was never a topic inside the bunker. The mass murder Rokas Misch referred to was the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime during World War II. He defended himself with facts, and that is because for him, truth didn't need drama, it needed honesty. Before the world had YouTube debates and history threads, one film dropped a bombshell of its own, and not everyone was ready for it. Downfall. In 2004, Germany released a film called Downfall. It focused on Hitler's final 12 days inside his Berlin bunker. Instead of showing him as a distant mythical figure, the movie portrayed a frail, paranoid man losing his grip on reality. The film was based on real memoirs and historical research, with Bruno Ganz delivering a chilling performance. The film's tone is clear from the start. It's about showing the end of a dictatorship through the eyes of those who lived through it. You see a man shaking from Parkinson's, yelling at his generals, sipping soup, and staring blankly at maps with imaginary armies. He pets his dog, comforts Eva Braun, and the next moment, orders death for deserters. It's uncomfortable to watch because he doesn't feel like a movie villain. He feels real. And maybe this is what made so many people uneasy. When Downfall was released, it caused instant backlash. Critics worried that showing Hitler as a human might feel like sympathy. Some feared the film could end up seducing younger generation viewers with emotion rather than warning. German critics asked, "Are we allowed to see Hitler cry?" Some argued the film risked unveiling evil and softening perceptions. But the filmmakers pushed back. They said this wasn't about softening history, it was about making it real. If we keep seeing Hitler as a cartoon villain, it becomes easy to separate ourselves from what happened. The hard truth is, he wasn't a monster from another planet. He was a man. And men like him rise to power because other people let them. The film makes that clear without needing to say it outright. Surveys showed broad public support. Nearly 70% of Germans felt showing a human side was okay. But critics remained uneasy. They doubted whether telling Hitler's story from such a personal, emotional angle risked downplaying mass atrocities. There's no mention of the Holocaust in the film. Its horror lives off-screen, only felt through Hitler's collapse and the personal tragedies in the bunker. When Downfall came out, Rokas Misch was alive, but silent for decades. Then, journalists began seeking his insights as the last surviving bunker witness. Misch had mixed feelings. He said the film was mostly accurate about facts, but he thought the emotional tones were exaggerated. He described it as Americanized. In his bunker, people rarely shouted. Most spoke quietly, even during panic. The film, with its loud scenes and dramatic outbursts, felt overly theatrical to him. Misch didn't criticize the film's honesty. He understood its purpose was to give history a human face, even if painful, but he stressed the real bunker was quieter. The fear was deeper than scenes could show. If you didn't watch carefully, you'd miss the real tension in the silence. Rokas Misch was a loyal guard to Hitler till the end. He still said later, he was no brute, he was no monster, he was no Superman. Very normal. Not like what is written, and he was a wonderful boss. So, was downfall perfect? No, but was it necessary? Maybe. Because it gave us something we rarely see, an inside view of how evil folds in on itself. But long after the gunfire stopped and the bunker fell silent, one question still lingered. What happened to the man who witnessed it all? Misch's legacy. Speaking of Rokas Misch's legacy, let's dive a bit into his personal life. Was he ever married? Well, Misch married Gerda on New Year's Eve, 1942. She didn't share his Nazi past with him. Gerda later joined the Social Democratic Party and became a respected teacher in Berlin. They stayed together until she died in 1998. The couple had one daughter, Brigitte, who became an architect and supported Jewish causes, which made Misch uncomfortable. After returning from Soviet captivity in 1954, Misch settled into civilian life. He ran a wallpaper and paint shop in South Berlin until 1986. It may have seemed ordinary, but the walls of that shop contained memories of a world no one else lived through. He stayed out of the public eye for decades. But in the 1990s, interest in the Führerbunker rose again. Documentaries, museum exhibits, even Hollywood films started asking questions. At first, Misch declined. Then, just as we mentioned earlier, he slowly began to open up. In 2008, he released his memoir, Hitler's Last Witness, co-written with Burkhard Nachtigall. It wasn't dramatic or sensational. It was matter-of-fact. He'd lived history, he said, and his job was to remember it without twisting it. He even consulted on Valkyrie, the film starring Tom Cruise about the plot to kill Hitler. He told filmmakers which doorways looked right, what the bunker smell felt like, how phones were answered in 1945. He didn't do it for fame. Still, part of his legacy remains controversial. Misch never expressed remorse for the Holocaust. That refusal to show regret upset many, including his own daughter, Brigitte. He was seen by some as too detached. Maybe he couldn't feel guilt, or maybe he didn't want to admit it. Regardless, he left behind something few others did, a first-hand memory of Hitler's last days. On September 5, 2013 in Berlin, Rokas Misch died after a short illness. With his death, the world lost the last living person who spent those final days inside Hitler's bunker. Reflecting on Misch's life raises hard questions. Can someone serve history's worst villain without expressing regret later on? Can silence hold the weight of truth? And what happens when someone finally speaks after decades? However, in July 2017, a surprising name surfaced, one that most people had never heard. The last known living survivor connected to Hitler's bunker wasn't the well-known bodyguard, Rokas Misch. It was someone else. The last eyewitness, Johanna Roef, who had only been a teenager when the war came crashing down, was just 15 years old back in 1945 and had been part of the Bund Deutscher Mädel. When schools shut down as Berlin fell apart, she didn't stay home. Instead, she volunteered to work as a paramedic. Her first post was at a bunker station near Anhalter Bahnhof. Not long after, she was transferred even closer to a site right beside the Reich Chancellery. This put her just steps away from the Führerbunker, the underground hideout where Hitler and his top men were holed up. Johanna was the youngest in a team of around 30 girls who rotated shifts as medics in that bunker zone. Life there was rough. There was barely any food. The nurses survived on glucose tablets and cold air. Outside, the streets were so dangerous that anyone seen moving risked getting shot. So they stayed below ground and did what they could. Even though she was only a teenager, Johanna kept a record of what she saw. She wrote on scraps of paper whatever she could find. Later, she copied those notes into notebooks, and eventually, she typed it all out. In 2017, her memoir finally came out with a sharp, unforgettable title, A Slap for Little Goebbels. That title wasn't made up. It came from a moment Johanna never forgot. One of the Goebbels' children, Helmut, was known for being mouthy. He once dared her to slap him. She did. Hours later, he and his siblings were dead, poisoned by their mother, Magda Goebbels. Johanna never came face to face with Hitler. She once said she wasn't invited into the main bunker because her blouse was too dirty, but she did care for people in his inner circle. For decades, Johanna didn't speak publicly. She kept her memories to herself. But in her late 80s, something changed. She felt like people needed to hear the truth. And when she finally told her story, people got a real glimpse of what it was like when everything was falling apart, and teenage girls were doing their best to treat the wounded in a city that was barely holding together. Unfortunately, Johanna Ruff passed away on June 21, 2023, at the age of 94. With her death, the last eyewitness tied to Hitler's bunker was gone. But then, if the man who stood beside Hitler in his final hours didn't see a monster, then have we misunderstood evil all along? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.